episode 3 of the Understanding America podcast. We are still discussing this book, A Voyage Long and Strange by Tony Horvitz. We've done two episodes thus far, and we discussed various expeditions. In the first episode, we discussed the Viking expeditions to the northern part of North America, and also the voyages of Columbus. In the second in the second episode, we discussed 3 expeditions or 3.5 expeditions. There was one which was the failed Narvaez expedition, the Cabeza de Vaca expedition. Then there was the semi-expedition of Fray Marcos de Niza to Cibola. Then there was the Coronado expedition and the De Soto expedition. So we started with the Vikings, then we went to the Spaniards, right? So in this episode, we're going to discuss essentially 2 chapters of early American pre-United States history. One is the French. So the French make their entry, okay, into North America. And then we're going to discuss the first English contact with the Americas. So we know that in 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon, he landed briefly in Florida, and he spoke about this wonderful, beautiful land. Then people made stories of the Fountain of Youth and all that. He eventually died there, Juan Ponce de Leon. So that's Florida. Now, and the Spaniards started exploring this land. We discussed these various expeditions in Florida, present-day Florida. At that time, Florida was essentially the land beyond what Ponce de Leon had said. So everything was Florida from the perspective of the Spaniards, okay? North of New Spain, which is presently Mexico, right? Now the French, they decided that why should we be left behind? We should also participate in the exploration of the Indies. It was called the Indies, the Indias, okay? And so they then start making forays to North America, okay? Starting with Florida. Now there is this misconception, okay, among lots of people, including most Americans, that the first Protestant colony in North America was a colony called Plymouth, which was founded in 1620 by a group of English Protestants called the Pilgrims. Okay, that's a very common misconception. But actually, the first Protestant colony was founded by the French Huguenots in the 1560s. So Huguenot is the French word, but it's the same for singular as well as plural. So to make it easier for the viewers to understand, I'll say Huguenot. It's actually Huguenot. So the Huguenots, they were French Protestants. Okay, and this was a movement of reform in Christianity. They said that the religion of the popes, the papal religion, was too decadent, and it had strayed too far from the original Christianity. So we need to reform Christianity. We need to. They abolished all the holidays, including Christmas. They outlawed dancing. They outlawed extramarital sex. They outlawed all nice, fun things in life and made the religion very austere. It was a kind of very austere. It was kind of a fundamentalist reform of Christianity, Protestantism. And in France, the Protestants were called the Huguenots. Okay? So, the Huguenots were followers of a gentleman called John Calvin, okay? He was based in Geneva, Switzerland. If you go to the University of Geneva today, then there's a wall called Reformation Wall on which there are 4 gentlemen whose statues are inscribed, and one of them is John Calvin, okay? So they sought to purify the way they worship God, and they sought to purify their behavior, and they were obviously against the Catholic way of life and way of worship and all that. So obviously that's going to cause strife in society. So they naturally faced religious persecution in various parts of Europe, including in France, the Protestants. And the Huguenots, they faced religious persecution in France. Eventually there was a big war of religions in France, which we'll not discuss in detail, but you have to understand the backdrop against which all of this is happening, the exploration of the Americas, right? So the Protestant leader or the leader of the Huguenots in France was a gentleman called Amiral Gaspard de Coligny. Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. Okay, he was a radical Protestant, but he was also a very close advisor of the Catholic Queen of France, Catherine de Medici.
Wow.
So it's a contradictory thing, contradictory nature of things, but that's how the world is. Nothing is black and white. Nothing is 1 + 1 = 2. Sometimes it's complicated. Now, like I said, the French had already made lots of inroads in the Americas. And the French and these Spanish galleons means ships, okay? Sailing ships. So they were bringing in American bullion into Spain. Bullion means raw gold.
Okay.
Raw precious metal is called bullion. Before you mint it and make it into coins or ingots or bricks or whatever, the raw thing is called bullion. So these Spanish ships were bringing in gold from the Americas. Of course, they did not discover gigantic quantities of gold like they had hoped, but they did find gold, especially in Southern America, etc. And they were bringing in large quantities of gold. And they followed something called the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is a current in the ocean. Just like we have currents of air in the atmosphere, we have currents of water in the ocean. And there is a famous current in the Atlantic, in the Northern Atlantic, called the Gulf Stream. So if you see England, okay, the English islands, including Ireland, Scotland, the British islands, let's call it the UK. It's at a latitude that if you go westwards along that latitude and you reach North America, you have polar bears there.
Okay.
That's how cold it is at the same latitude in North America. But in the UK today, it's much warmer than that. And then along the same latitude in North America. Why is that? Because of the effect of the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream forms there and flows there and makes the weather more temperate. It's a warm stream of water. And you have these currents in all the oceans. You have Indian Ocean currents, you have the Japanese current called the Kuroshio, and so on. So Juan Ponce de Leon was the first person to discover and describe this warm current of water, which eventually came to be known the Gulf Stream. So these Spanish vessels, ships, would travel along the Gulf Stream. It's like if you're a sprinter and you get a wind at your back, then it helps you go faster, right?
Correct.
Or if you're flying in an aircraft and you have a tailwind, then it makes you go faster. Same way, the Gulf Stream would help them, navigate the oceans better and faster. So they followed the Gulf Stream, these Spanish ships, and they brought all this gold and treasure into Spain, and it made Spain fabulously wealthy. So the French said that why don't we also participate in this quest? And we could even see France and Spain were no friends. Okay, they were rival powers.
Right.
So they also thought that let's establish our own colonies. And maybe we can threaten the Spanish hold on the Americas and so on. So it's a geopolitical thing. It's a strategic thing, and it's also about not losing out on the easy riches of the Americas and all that. So the French decided that we should go this, and the person who was at the forefront of this was Amiral Gaspard de Coligny, the Protestant Huguenot leader in France. So he won backing. He gained backing from the royalty, from the Queen, from the crown of France, to create a Huguenot colony on the Atlantic coast of North America, which was then called Florida. And they had earlier tried this in South America also, and that had not succeeded. But this time they decided we'll do it on the Atlantic coast of North America. And so the reasoning for the crown would have been that let's get rid of some of these Protestants, these troublemakers. Let them go and live in North America. So that way the land will become a part of France. And we'll also get rid of these troublemakers. I mean, we have a mainly Catholic society, and it's best to get rid of them and still have them be useful to the nation. So that's why this thing happened. So the expedition was planned. And as the leader of the expedition, Amiral Gaspard de Coligny, he chose a Huguenot captain whose name was Jean Ribault. Jean Ribault. Okay, I'm kind of mangling the pronunciation to make it more understandable to the English-speaking audience, but yeah. So the captain of the expedition was Jean Ribault, and accompanying him was another captain whose name was René de Laudonnière. René de Laudonnière, and there were about 150 or so crew people who were all Protestants, Huguenots. So they cross the Atlantic, and then they land on the Atlantic coast of America, somewhere in Florida, and they see many rivers there. And so when they first land there, when Jean Ribault first lands there, he lands near a river, and he lands on the 1st of May in 1562. Okay. 1st of May 1562. So because it was May Day, he calls this the Rivière de Mai, the River of May.
Okay.
He names the river the Rivière de Mai, River of May. It's now called St. John's River. Okay. And to commemorate the first French landing in North America, he erected a stone column over there, engraved with the fleur de lis, which is the French royal symbol. Okay, it's no longer used a lot, but it was the symbol of French royalty, the fleur de lis. Okay, so he erects this stone column over there, and then they sail northwards, and along the way they find many rivers, and Jean Ribault decides to name these rivers after French rivers. So the Seine, the Somme, the Loire, and all that. He names all the rivers after French rivers. Okay, naturally. And eventually they come to a place near present-day Beaufort in South Carolina, and they build a small fort over there. Okay, so they land there and they build what they hope will be a permanent settlement, a fort. And they call this fort Port Royal. That's the name they give it. Okay, so Jean Ribault lands over there. He has his men erect this fort. They call it Port Royal, essentially, in English. And then they have to go back to France for resupplies, because they need supplies. You know, if you want to have a permanent long-term settlement, you need supplies. So this was first essentially a voyage of reconnaissance, of discovery. So they found some locations and they erected a stone column. They built a fort. So then Jean Ribault goes back to France. He says that he leaves behind 30 men. He gives a great speech that those of you who stay behind will always forever be remembered in the history of France as the first Frenchmen to settle down in North America, and so on and so forth. He gives a wonderful speech. 30 guys decide to stay behind. He leaves them behind, and he promises to return as soon as possible with supplies. Okay? So he goes back to France. He returns to France and he discovers the nation in civil war.
Oh, God.
Okay, there's civil war going on in France.
Yes.
So he is not able to make true on his promise to return as soon as possible with supplies. So very soon what happens in Port Royal is that these gentlemen who have been left behind, they don't know how to live off the land. It's not a very good location because it's marshy, it's swampy and all that. And they don't know how to plant crops. And they do make contact with Indians and all, but the Indians also have limited supplies of things and that sort of thing. So the situation rapidly deteriorates. They after a while they're eating roots and berries and still starving, and some of them are eating puppies. Oh. Yes, they're eating little puppies just to stay alive. And eventually they decide that we got to go back home. So they build a homemade handicrafted vessel, ship of some kind, and they cross the ocean, and in the middle of the Atlantic there's suddenly a situation that there's no wind, so they're stuck there. They're not going forward, back, anywhere. They're stuck.
Those 30 guys. Yeah.
Those 30 guys. And they run out of water, they run out of food. I think they still had water, but they ran out of food. They had to drink their own urine eventually. And eventually they had to decide that we're gonna do a random selection of one person.
For what?
And we shall cannibalize the person.
Oh.
So they decided they chose one person. They killed him, they drank his warm blood, and they divided his meat into equal rations for everybody. So that's what was going on in the Atlantic. Eventually they were rescued by an English ship. The English were also Protestants. Around that time, Henry VIII had turned the whole nation around.
Yes.
180 degrees, yeah. The Anne Boleyn affair, right? the English were Protestants. They have no love for the French, but fellow Protestants in great danger. So let's rescue them. So they were rescued by an English ship and brought back eventually to the mainland, to Europe, to France eventually. Now there is, like I said, there was civil war going on in France, and Jean Ribault, he fled to England to escape the persecution and whatnot, and he offered his services to Queen Elizabeth. She did not trust him, so he was thrown into the English to the Tower of London, which is a great prison. It still stands. Okay, so he was imprisoned in England. So she throws him in the Tower of London, and eventually, when this entire fighting in France ceases for a while, the French Protestant leader, Amiral Coligny, he decides to renew the plans for colonization. So he knows that the first colony has failed, Port Royal. Everybody came back. Eventually, those 30 guys, minus one, came back to France. Okay?
Right. Okay.
Now we need to renew the plans and go ahead with the plans again, because we want to establish a colony in the Americas. So Amiral Coligny renewed his colonizing plans, and this time because Jean Ribault was in prison in England, so he had to choose a different captain. So this time he chose Monsieur René de Laudonnière, who was on the first voyage. Okay, voyage. Why am I saying voyage? He was on the first voyage. René de Laudonnière, as the commander of the second expedition. So 1564, we have the new expedition, which is led by René de Laudonnière. He was a dandy. He was fond of very nice clothing and luxuries and comforts and all that. But he was a reasonably able sailor and commander. So the second expedition starts in 1564. This time there are about 300 Huguenots who are part of the expedition. This includes women and artisans and an artist to make sketches and drawings and all that.
So these are all supported by the King and the Queen of France.
Well, it was supported by Amiral Coligny, but yes, without the support of the crown, this won't happen. And the crown wanted to get rid of as many Protestants as possible, so it was all along. It was all approved. So René de Laudonnière, with his 300 people, he crosses the Atlantic and they land once again at the Rivière de Mai, the River of May. And he finds that this stone column is still standing and the Indians are there, the natives are there, and they've decorated it with flowers and fruits, and they give the French a very wonderful welcome. And there is still a surviving painting of this episode. There's a painting of a large Indian chief who is welcoming a smaller French guy who's wearing very fancy clothes. That is René de Laudonnière, and the Indian person who's welcoming him is the chief of the local Indians. Okay, so this painting still exists. The guys, the French were welcomed with warm hospitality by the Indians. They were treated very well. They were given food and nice offerings and all that. So the French then, they built a triangular fort called La Caroline. This was to honor their king. Their king was Charles IX. In Latin, you say Carolus for Charles. So this was named after him, La Caroline, this fort. So they built this nice fort. And the French, they had a very different approach from the Spanish. The Spanish were barbarians, essentially, in their colonizing efforts in the Americas. All genocide, all massacres and murders and plunder and all that. We know every single person we have, every expedition that we have discussed, it's been like that. Whether it is the Narvaez expedition, they fought the Indians for a long time. Whether it is the Coronado expedition or the De Soto expedition, which was the worst. The French had a very different approach. They did not want to offend the natives. They wanted to have good relations with the natives. And they wrote about the natives, how well proportioned their bodies are and how handsome and beautiful the natives are, that sort of thing. So they were a different kind of
approach.
They had a very different approach. So they had friendly relations with the Indians under the leadership of René de Laudonnière. And so on. And they also admired the Indian cuisine, because the French love cuisine. So the moment they land, they have these good relations with the Indians. They establish a triangular fort, like Caroline. They set up a bakery, because every French settlement needs to have a nice bakery, boulangerie, and so on. But eventually what happens is that these people, the colonists, they did not have any real survival skills in this strange land. And they had limited supplies, and they did not have a single farmer on board or a person who knows farming. They had no seeds to sow and all. So what they were doing is they were trading, nice little trinkets and stuff with the Indians. We give them some nice beads and things, and they will give us corn and food, that sort of thing, barter system. Eventually they ran out of trade goods. And then the question was, what do we do? So they started stealing from the Indians.
Oh.
They did not massacre the Indians, but they started stealing from the Indians. Now the Indians, the locals, they also had limited supplies of things, of crops and food and all that food stuff. So they started raiding and stealing from the Indians, which obviously is going to erode the goodwill that you had with these people. So that happened, and then René de Laudonnière was accused of being a hypocrite. Okay, he gave strict orders that the colonists should not cohabitate or intermarry with the local women. Strictly no. And we are Protestants, we don't do that. But he had brought along what he called a chambermaid from France to accompany him, and the colonists accused him of having a mistress in her. Yeah. So essentially, she was his mistress, apparently. So his leadership style in his personal life, it drew resentment. Resentment started growing against him among the people he was leading. And then some colonists, they said that we'll take one of the ships and we'll go raid Spanish ships. So they started indulging in piracy. Okay, they went on a raiding expedition. So we can get some nice gold and also some supplies, food and all. So justified, no? So they went on a raiding expedition. When they returned, Laudonnière, he had the ringleaders hanged.
Oh.
So this again created more resentment. And by 1565, they were facing starvation. So they prepared to abandon the colony with and Laudonnière was okay with that. Obviously, they had no choice. They had to go back. So they prepared to abandon the colony. They prepared the ships and all that. And then suddenly, three things happen. There's the arrival of three set of ships, one after the other. First of all, there was a ship or a bunch of ships came over there. It was captained or led by John Hawkins, who was an English privateer.
Okay.
What's privateer, I wonder? See, essentially privateer means a person who has a private enterprise, an entrepreneur of kinds. And he's indulging in non-state sanctioned or non-state supported expeditions in various parts of the world. That's privateer. But actually, privateers were something else. The spelling of privateer is Privateer. You can remove some of the letters and rearrange it to Pirate, pirate.
Okay.
So privateers were pirates, okay? Glorified privates.
Okay, private.
So John Hawkins comes with his ships, and his ships are full of stuff. He's got food, he's got weapons, he's got a few hundred slaves that he has purchased from Africa, and he wants to trade in the West Indies and so on. So John Hawkins arrives there, and he sees these French people, and he says that the French are so lazy. They can't even, they're living in such a wonderful land which is so full of resources, and yet they are starving. And the French have this tendency to want somebody else to do the labor for them, and they can enjoy it. So that's the kind of thing he wrote, which is strange because he was doing slave trading and piracy. But anyway, so what he did is that he told the French, I'll give you a ship armed with supplies. You take it. You have to give me the cannons on your fort. So they had a fort, right? La Caroline.
Yes.
So he said, you give me the cannons and all your artillery and all that. Okay, and I'll give you a ship and all the food and whatever you need. So you'll no longer starve and you can go back home. So that's the deal he did with them. Because they were fellow Protestants. So he was kind of a little bit, a bit of concern. So that happened. Okay. So they were living in such fertile land, and he was like, what the hell are you people doing? You can't even survive here. I mean, where else will you survive? Anyway, so he gave them a ship with supplies, and he took their cannons, and he went off on his merry way to do some more privateering or piracy. Okay. Now that this has happened, they're all happy, the colonists, and they say, okay, now we can go back home. We have food and we'll be able to survive on the voyage home, and let's go back home. The moment they try to do that, another convoy of ships arrives. And this time it is Jean Ribault, who was imprisoned in the Tower of London.
Oh, how did he escape from there?
So he was eventually freed from the Tower of London. Okay, and he went back to France, and he came back, and then he undertook a voyage across the Atlantic with reinforcements and supplies. So he brought reinforcements, more people, and supplies. And his intention was to replace René de Laudonnière, because the news had reached France that Laudonnière was living a very hypocritical life. He was not leading well, and he had a mistress and all that, and so on. So once this guy comes, Jean Ribault, and he announces that this is my intention, he tells Laudonnière, René de Laudonnière falls sick. He said, he was not leading poorly. He may have been living with a mistress, but apart from that, he was not doing any other thing, which was wrong. So these accusations shocked him, and he became depressed and he fell sick. Okay, so he was accused of hoarding food. Okay, he was not hoarding food. They were all starving.
Yeah.
But he had been accused of hoarding food. So he's living well, his mistress is living well, everybody else is starving. That sort of thing. But it was clearly not the case. So when he heard this, it shocked him, and he became depressed and he fell sick. So now we have supplies that have come in large quantity. We have reinforcements. Jean Ribault is back with more men. So now perhaps there is no need to abandon La Caroline and the colony. But then a third convoy of ships arrives on the horizon, and it quickly approaches the French vessels. So on one of the French ships, somebody was standing there, and one of the Spanish ships came all the way close that you could have a conversation with each other. And the Spanish commander asked, "Which people are you?"
Okay.
So on the French side, somebody said, "We are French. We are French. And who are you?" So the Spanish commander said, "I am Pedro Menéndez de Aviles, and I am the servant of the King of Spain, and I have been tasked with coming here, and my job is to hang all the Calvinists I find here. All the Protestants, all the Huguenots I find here."
Oh, God.
So then there is a sea battle, a brief battle between the two fleets, and the Spanish are repelled. Okay, the French win this small engagement, and the Spanish fleet escapes southwards. They go about 60 or so miles southwards, and they establish a colony about 60 miles south of La Caroline. Okay, we're talking about the Florida region, more or less.
Yeah.
North Carolina.
Yeah.
Florida.
Yeah.
We're talking about Florida here. Okay, so they establish a settlement about 60 miles south of La Caroline. And they call it Saint Augustine. Okay, they establish a fort essentially called Saint Augustine. They established this on the 8th of September, 1565. The Spaniards. Okay, so they have this gunfight, naval fight with the French, but the French are superior in the fight. They succeed, so they go down south and they establish Saint Augustine. So now that the Spanish have escaped down south, they've fled. So Jean Ribault says, "Hey, why not? Let's pursue them and finish them off. Why wait? Why let them establish a stronghold somewhere? Let's pursue them and finish them off." And René de Laudonnière, the guy who was sick, he said, "Don't do this, please. We are now in September. This is the hurricane season. It is not a good idea to take your ships and pursue this guy." But Ribault was a great fan of his own opinion. Okay, so he did not listen to Laudonnière, and he pursued the Spanish, and with most of the manpower that he had at his disposal. So, okay, that's gone. So, this left La Caroline undermanned. Okay, naturally a hurricane came. Hurricane is a gigantic cyclonic storm, and it essentially blew Ribault's fleet all across the place. It sent them far into the ocean. They were not able to pursue the Spaniards or engage the Spaniards in battle. Some of the ships may have been wrecked. And it was a disaster, essentially. Okay, but so it was not the destruction of the entire fleet, but they were not able to engage the Spanish in battle, and they were blown far out to sea. So if they had listened to René de Laudonnière, this would not have happened. But Ribault was like, no, I'm right. So then Menéndez, okay, Pedro Menéndez the Avilés, he gambles. Okay, these guys have blown off to sea. They're far away. It's going to take them time to come back. Let's march on La Caroline and attack. Let's not wait. Go straight. So they march. They march northwards. They're about 60 miles south of La Caroline, St. Augustine. So they march 3 days through bad weather, swampy terrain, water up to your waist and all that. But they march 3 days. And on the morning, at dawn on the third day, they can see La Caroline. So they quickly have a Catholic prayer for victory, and then they attack. And the French are still sleeping, and they had no idea the Spanish would dare do such a thing in such a short time. So they're still sleeping, they're still yawning and all, and suddenly there's an attack on the fort, and the fort is quickly breached. And Laudonnière, when he realizes this is happening, he's still sick, but he grabs his sword and he fights for a while. And then he says that it is hopeless, so he tells his people, let's escape, as many of us as we can. So they all escape from the fort. They are not captured by the Spanish, a handful of people, including René de Laudonnière. And they then find one of their ships, and they cross the Atlantic and return to France. So René de Laudonnière escapes across the Atlantic. It takes him about 3 months to reach France, during which time he and the remaining survivors, they have to eat hard biscuits and just drink water. They have nothing else to consume, but they survived and they reached France. Now, the remaining survivors who were not killed in this battle at La Caroline, they were captured by the Spanish. And Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, he told them that I am under orders from my king, King Philip II of Spain, to hang all Protestants. I will not allow any of you to survive if you are not Christians, which means Catholics from his perspective. So, most of the survivors in the fort, including soldiers, non-soldiers, civilians, everybody, were slaughtered. About 142 were slaughtered by the Spaniards in a massacre. And they spared women and children, although Menéndez wrote that he was disgusted that these horrible non-Christian people are living among my people. But he allowed women and children, some of them, to survive. Okay, so they capture La Caroline, the Spanish. The French are defeated. But you remember that Jean Ribault, his fleet was blown out to sea. So eventually they made their way back to land. And they landed somewhere in the south. Okay, they landed somewhere in the south. They were stranded, I think, south of St. Augustine or somewhere near St. Augustine, where the Spanish had built a hasty fort. The Spanish were all in La Caroline. So they started going, the French, once they landed, they started going northwards towards La Caroline. They had no idea La Caroline was taken. Okay, they're going north. So they reach a river on their way north towards La Caroline. And the Spanish are on the other side of the river, but the French don't know it. Menéndez is there, and he has asked his soldiers to stay hidden behind the bushes and the foliage. And he comes out to the river with a couple of men, and he makes, through sign language, asks who are you guys and what are you doing? So the French send a guy across the river, swimming across the river. And he goes to Menéndez and says that, we are the people of Jean Ribault, and we need safe passage back to La Caroline. We are asking you for safe passage back to La Caroline. He doesn't say the soldiers who are hidden and all that. So Menéndez says that I cannot offer you for safe passage. I would advise you to surrender to my mercy. Okay, and let me decide what to be done with you. And the French even offered him bribes and a ransom, and they said, we'll give you all our weapons and all that. But Menéndez said, no, nothing doing. You need to surrender to my mercy and let me decide your fate. So the French, they surrender to Menéndez. Okay, they cross the river. They probably think that we have been promised mercy. They surrender. The soldiers turn up, after the weapons are given to Menéndez, and they are tied up. And Menéndez asks them, among you, how many of you are Lutherans? How many of you are Catholics?
Okay.
And they say, we're all Lutherans. He says, then you will be killed. So then a few of them say that we are willing to be baptized as Catholics. A few of them. The rest say, we don't care. We are Lutherans. So he has them all stabbed in the chest. Another massacre. Okay? And then the same thing happens a couple of days later. So in total, there were 2 massacres along this river, on the banks of this river. About 200 men were killed.
Oh.
Most of them were stabbed in the chest after being bound. Their hands were bound. Some of them were hanged on trees. So about 200 people are killed in total, in different ways, by the Spanish. About 200 French men are killed, including Jean Ribault. Okay? And Menéndez writes that it is great that Jean Ribault is dead, because a person like him, he can achieve more in 1 year than other men can do in 10 years. He's one of the greatest sea captains of the French, and I'm glad that he's dead. Okay? So this place where this happened, where these slaughters, these massacres happened, it came to be known in Spanish as Matanzas, which means slaughters or massacres. And that site is still called Matanzas today. And the river where this happened is called the Matanzas River. So the Spanish succeeded in destroying the French colony and fort at La Caroline. Most of the French were massacred. He spared some musicians, etc., because they would be useful in playing music when the Spanish needed to dance or do some merrymaking. So essentially, he spared a few women and children at La Caroline. And when he captured the French on the banks of the river, Matanzas, he killed most of them, apart from a few of the French who said that we are willing to be baptized as Catholics. And he also spared a few musicians because he wanted a private orchestra, apparently. So that's the disaster of the French colony at La Caroline. This guy, Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, he was an astute soldier. He was a very experienced seaman. He was an experienced veteran warrior. And he turned out to be a great diplomat as well, because he established excellent relations with the local Indians, the local natives, after all of this has happened. Okay, after the massacres and all that, he had this place called Saint Augustine, and he wanted this fort to last long. So he established good relations with various Indian tribes. He even had Indian tribes that were at loggerheads, that were warring against each other. He had them do ceasefires and all that, and because of this, and this started the moment he landed and established Saint Augustine. And because of this, he always knew what everybody else was up to, because the Indians acted as his informers. And he even married an Indian lady. And he had her baptized as Catholic, and he even married an Indian woman, despite having a wife in Spain. Okay, so technically he was doing something abominable, because you can't have polygamy in Catholicism, but he was okay with that. So this is what happens in 1565. Matanzas, the massacre of the French by the Spanish. So eventually, news of these massacres reaches France. And the French are outraged. The national pride is wounded. So eventually, the French send expeditions back in the region. In 1568, the French attack the Spanish garrison, the Spanish army at Fort Caroline, which they now control.
Yeah.
And they killed hundreds of Spanish. And many of them were hanged on the same trees where the Spanish had hanged the French 3 years prior to this incident. Okay? But the French eventually failed to reclaim Florida. And the Spanish made a sizable, significant, robust presence in Florida. So the French objective of creating a Huguenot colony on the coast on the Atlantic coast of North America, it failed. Eventually, they were able to do it in Canada, etc. But that's not what we're discussing today. So the French, they failed to reclaim Florida. They did avenge the national pride that was insulted and outraged by the Spanish massacre of the French by massacring a whole lot more Spanish. But did not long term. They did not make any significant change in the geopolitical balance of power. So Spain secured its hold on Florida. And Menéndez built many settlements, many Christian missions, and he brought in lots of Spanish families and settled them. He also brought in the first African slaves to be disembarked on the shores of what is now the United States. And so Menéndez was successful, and the French Huguenots failed. And in 1574, Menéndez was getting ready to attack Northern Europe, but that's when he died, of old age, I suppose. And Saint Augustine, which was built as a very hasty settlement by Menéndez, when he landed after losing the naval fight to the French, it still exists today. Okay, it has survived. It was established in 1565, and it has endured all kinds of hardships, including mutinies, pirate raids, rebellions, disease, whatnot. And it is the oldest continuously inhabited European-founded city in what is called the continental US. It still exists. It's like very close to present-day Jacksonville in Florida. Okay, it still exists. So if you go to the place of to the location of Fort Caroline today, you will find a recreation of the fort, but they don't quite know where the original fort was located exactly. They know the rough location where it was, and there's a recreation. There's a replica of the fort, a quasi replica of the fort that's built over there. And when American visitors, reach this place, they suddenly are confronted with the fact that the French established the first Protestant settlement in what is now the US, decades before before Plymouth or even Jamestown. And most Americans don't like this, and they quickly leave the place because America is an Anglo nation, right? It's founded by the Anglos, the English. But then they discover the French were the ones who actually started this. So there is that. And there are some tourists who like to commemorate the French Protestant colony, okay, and as part of American heritage. And evangelical groups are operational there, and they see Fort Caroline as a sacred site for the nation's first Protestants, and they hold prayer sessions and they erect crosses over there, which the park rangers then have to remove because you have separation of church and state in the US. Yeah. And the Huguenots are portrayed as martyrs who died for their faith, and that sort of thing. So if you go to St. Augustine today, there is a strange tourist culture there. The city, it promotes Juan Ponce de Leon as its founder for some reason. And there are multiple fountains of youth over there. And you can go and have a sip of the water over there, a glass of water, which will apparently make you younger. Even though Ponce de Leon never ever looked for a fountain of youth, he never ever found a fountain of youth. And I'm not sure even if he even landed over there. But Ponce de Leon is commemorated over there. The Fountain of Youth, there are multiple commercial fountains of youth over there. And near this so-called Fountain of Youth, the big one, there is a cemetery of the Timuacan Indians. And over there you will see burials from various dates. Some of them are buried with grave goods, okay, goods that you put in the grave to use in your afterlife. And some Indians have no grave goods and they're buried like this. Okay, their arms crossed over their chests. They're the first to be converted to Catholicism. Okay, so you find over there. And most of these Indians, they obviously died of disease because of contact with the Europeans. So that's the kind of thing it is. And every year there's a reenactment of the landing of Menéndez over there, the guy who slaughtered so many Frenchmen. Okay. And city officials, they say that St. Augustine is America's oldest city. And some of them celebrate the royal heritage of the Spanish. And some people criticize it, saying that this is a place of terrible violence and slaughters and all that. Now, there is a historian and a former priest whose name is Michael Gannon. Michael Gannon. He discovered that when Menéndez he established Saint Augustine, and like I said, he was a good diplomat. He had good relations. He had established good relations with the Indians. So in 1565, he held a mass, a prayer ceremony, and then he had a feast in which he and the Spaniards shared a meal with the natives who were his allies. It was a kind of a Thanksgiving ceremony. So in America, there's a festival called Thanksgiving, which is about a similar feast that happened around 1620. Around that time. We'll look into the exact date later. And it was done by the pilgrims and the Indians who were helping them at the time, much later. But the first Thanksgiving actually happened in 1565. It was done by the Spaniards with the local Timuacan Indians. And there's a big controversy that rages around this. And this guy, Michael Gannon, is depicted as the Grinch who stole Thanksgiving, because he has a different version of the original Thanksgiving and all that. Yep. So that's the story of the French attempt to create a Huguenot colony in Florida. It failed, and the Spanish prevailed, and they reinforced their hold over Florida. Okay, that's the first part of this book that we are discussing today. The second thing that we will discuss today is the case, the saga of Roanoke Island, Roanoke Island, the lost colony of Roanoke, which is still a big mystery in the United States today. Okay, so now to understand that, we have to look at the background, which is England. Okay, so let's revisit British history very, very briefly. In 1483, the last Plantagenet king, Richard III, came to power. And 3 years later, he lost to Henry VII at the Battle of Bosworth Field. And he lost his crown, he lost his life. And he was buried, he was thrown into a hasty grave in a church, and the church disappeared eventually. And for 500 years, roughly, his body was not found. And they recently rediscovered the body of Richard III. He had scoliosis, the curved back thing. He was found under a car park.
Oh.
Okay, that's Richard III. So he dies, and the crown is forcibly taken by Henry VII. And this is the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. Tudors. Henry VII operates or rules from 1485 until 1509. When he dies, his son Henry VIII comes to power. And Henry VIII rules from 1509 to 1547. Then his son, who lived, his son with Jane Seymour, I think, whose name was Edward VI, he comes to power. He's still a boy. And he rules from 1547 to 1553 when he dies. When he dies, his sister, half-sister Mary I, becomes queen. She is the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. And Mary I tries to undo everything her father did. Her mother was a Catholic. Her father was an Anglican Protestant. So she tries to undo everything her father did. And she tries to reimpose Catholicism on England. And there's a tremendous amount of strife in England. She does it with a very brutal, through brutal methods. And because of that, Mary I is called Bloody Mary. But she doesn't live long. From 1553, she
So she was the daughter of the not Anne Boleyn's mom, right?
Yeah, Mary I was the daughter of Anne Boleyn. You're right. She was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon.
Yes, that is what.
Catherine of Aragon. You're right. You're right. Mary I was the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, not Anne Boleyn.
Yeah, that's.
So she rules from 1553 to 1558, and she unleashes a reign of terror in England. Lots of people are killed and all kinds of violence and brutality happens, which is why she's called Bloody Mary. But she also isn't very healthy, and she dies in 1558. And then her half-sister Elizabeth comes to power. She becomes the Queen of England. She's the daughter of Anne Boleyn.
Yes.
Okay. So she rules from 1558 all the way to 1603. Okay, that's 45 years. And it's kind of a golden age of England. All kinds of good things happen. And when she dies in 1603, her cousin, James the First, comes to power because Elizabeth was the virgin queen. She had no children, no offspring. So when she died, her cousin James the First, who was a grandson of Henry VII or a descendant of Henry VII, comes to power. So he is her cousin, same family, and he was the first in line after her. So he comes to power. So that's the backdrop. So James the First rules from 1603 to 1625. Now, let's revisit America because that's what we're talking about. The common American narrative, worldview, is that their ancient English ancestors were religious refugees seeking freedom. Just like the French Huguenots were Protestants who sought religious freedom across the Atlantic because they were persecuted in France. Similarly, the Americans think of their English ancestors as religious refugees, the pilgrims who came to the Americas seeking religious freedom and the right to worship whichever way they wanted, and so on. The truth is that the earliest English involved in the exploration of North America were actually more like the Spanish conquistadors.
Oh, yeah.
They were slave traders, they were pirates, they were adventurers, and they were not usually men of very high moral standing, and their methods were often very not very nice methods. Okay, so that's the truth about the actual English ancestors of the Americans. Okay, now, so we spoke about the lineage of the kings and queens of England. So Elizabeth comes to power 1558, okay, and she faces all kinds of constraints in England. So England has a population of about 3 million at the time, okay, and it is not yet united with Scotland. And it's facing troubles in Ireland as well. The English want to colonize Ireland, they want to colonize Scotland, but obviously there's tremendous resistance in these lands to English attempts to colonize them. And the English had one last territory in continental Europe, which was Calais, present-day France, and they had just lost that as well. So it was a shrinking empire. They were trying to expand northwards into Scotland and Ireland, a population of 3 million, and it was economically not well off. Militarily, it was not a strong power. Okay, it was not one of the great powers of Europe. It was a second rank or third rank European power. And they had some fishing boats that would do cod fishing off the coast of Newfoundland in extreme North America, present-day Canada. And that's the only tenuous foothold they had in North America. And they had no other colony or anything in North America. So that's the backdrop against which we're going to discuss Roanoke Island and the saga of that. And more background. In 1496, Henry VII, the first of the Tudor kings, he had commissioned a guy called John Cabot to explore these new lands of the Americas and claim them if possible. So in 1497, the next year, John Cabot landed in Newfoundland, okay? And he did not find any evidence of riches because Newfoundland is frighteningly cold and it's not a nice place to be if you don't have any resources with you. So he went there, he found minimal evidence of riches, and then eventually he tried a second voyage. He never came back. So he was lost at sea, John Cabot, okay? Who was commissioned by Richard VII. Now in 1536, many years later, another amateur explorer whose name was Richard Hore, H-O-R-E, he reached somewhere along the along the Atlantic coast of the Americas. His crew disembarked, and they also tried to establish a colony of some kind, but obviously they were amateurs. They had no farmers, they had no means, so they did not know how to trap animals or live off the land or anything, so they resorted to cannibalism. You'll find plenty of instances of cannibalism among the first European explorers in North America, in the Americas. And Richard Hore and his men, they eventually seized a French ship and to return home. So they seized a French ship that was on a business expedition. They seized it and they returned home. And the French said, knock, knock, Henry VIII. See what you guys have done. So Henry VIII regrettably had to pay the French out of his own pocket. And then he said, I am never going to look in the direction of the Americas again.
Okay.
I'm going to be busy dissolving marriages and dissolving monasteries. Okay? And beheading wives. So that was the end of the thing as far as Henry VIII was concerned. He was too busy playing around in his own backyard. And trying to, whatever. He's
That's
a
a
whole
British,
different individual. We'll not discuss him here. So English interest in North America ended for a long time until Elizabeth became queen. So after Henry VIII dies, his son becomes king. Then his daughter Mary the First becomes queen. And then Elizabeth becomes queen. And Elizabeth was a whole different person. She was one of the greats of the English royal lineage. So 1558, Elizabeth the First becomes Queen of England. And she has interesting policies. So she knows that her national power isn't strong enough to challenge Spain. She was concerned about trespassing on Spanish claimed lands, but she was okay with her men doing what was then called journeys of pickery.
What is that?
Pickery.
Okay.
Pirate raids.
Oh.
So during her time, piracy was state-sponsored. It had the royal backing of the crown of England, and many such entrepreneurs started flourishing. Privateers, pirates, okay, on journeys of pickery. One was John Hawkins, who we mentioned
Earlier.
Yes, who kind of resupplied the French Huguenots under René de Laudonnière. So one of these great privateers was John Hawkins. He was eventually knighted by Queen Elizabeth, which obviously is a state endorsement of his activities, right? So his niche was that he would, what he would do is that he would gather slaves, African slaves on the coast of Africa. He would steal these slaves from the Spanish, and then he would go to the West Indies, Caribbean region, and he would sell the slaves there. So he gets free slaves by stealing them from the Spanish. Then he sells them in the Hispaniola in that area, in the Caribbean, and he gets rich as a consequence. And that also disrupts Spanish activities. So it's good for England geopolitically. So it's like guerrilla warfare essentially, slavery, state-sponsored guerrilla warfare. Okay, it's like a proxy war of some kind. Oh, not really proxy war, but guerrilla warfare. So this guy, John Hawkins, was one of the major privateers or pirates. In 1567, John Hawkins, he lost a fight against the Spanish in the Caribbean region, the Florida region. He lost a fight, a naval fight. And he had to leave behind approximately 100 men stranded along the Gulf of Mexico. And now it's apparently called the Gulf of America. Trump has changed the name, but we're talking about historical facts. So it was the Gulf of Mexico. So about 100 men were left behind, stranded over there. And some wandered north into the interior of America, some went elsewhere. And their experiences laid the groundwork of many tales of fabulous riches. 100 men. Eventually, 3 survivors reached the Atlantic out of those 100 and were able to cross the Atlantic. They hitched a ride home to England aboard a French vessel. And they reached England. So of these 100 men left behind by John Hawkins, only 3 were able to reach England. Okay? So in the 1570s, so this was in 1567 that these guys were left behind. Now in the 1570s, a small circle of influential English men began to advocate the colonization of America. They knew that the Spanish had become bloated on the riches that were flowing in from the Americas. They knew the French were interested. So the English said that why should we be left behind? There are easy riches to be made. We should also participate. And this is when Elizabeth is the Queen of England. So one of those 3 sailors or men who survived out of the 100 that John Hawkins left behind, one of them was a man called David Ingram. David Ingram. So he was a great storyteller. And these influential Englishmen, they were looking out, where are the survivors? And they found David Ingram. So he told them the stories of what he saw in North America. He said he had seen elephants. He had seen fire dragons. He had seen red ships. He had seen nuggets of gold as big as a man's fist. He had seen pearls as big as a man's fist. And he had seen Indian cities with streets wider than those of London and tremendous, fabulous riches. Okay? So these are the stories told by David Ingram. And he also said that somewhere in the interior of America, there is a wonderful place, a land called Norumbega, whatever, I don't know what the pronunciation is, but it's a wonderful land of riches. And in this northern region, there's a river, a great river that leads westwards. And it is the long sought after northwest passage to the Pacific Ocean. So you reach this land, you can go by river all the way to the Pacific. How fantastic is that?
Yeah.
Right? It's a shortcut to the Pacific and to India. Okay? That sort of thing. So David Ingram's tales were extremely influential. And David Ingram also said that in the interior of the Americas, of North America, there are natives who speak Welsh. And they have, and this revived an old legend. The legend was that in the 12th century, a Welsh prince called Madoc sailed west of the Atlantic, and he supposedly landed in America. So this tale of John Ingram's of Welsh-speaking natives, it revived that old legend of Prince Madoc, a Welsh prince. So all these stories, which for those people were reports, factual reports, right? And the rumors of Norumbega and the tremendous wealth over there, and the strategic positioning and the northwest passage to the Pacific Ocean, all of that, it stirred a great amount of interest in planting the English flag in North America, okay? And planting an English colony somewhere north of Spanish-held Florida. So they knew that they could not tangle with the Spanish; they were too powerful. So let's go somewhere north of their stronghold of Florida, and let's plant the English flag and colonies north of Florida. So eventually, a gentleman called Sir Humphrey Gilbert, he won a charter from the English crown to do such an expedition. So he was licensed to explore and claim lands not possessed of any Christian prince, which means neither the Spanish nor the French should possess these lands. Find such a land and possess it for England, claim it for England. Now this guy, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, he was a veteran soldier. Veteran, he must have been in his 30s perhaps at the time, but he was already an experienced, seasoned soldier. He had seen service and action in Ireland. The English were trying to colonize Ireland through tremendously brutal means, naturally, during Elizabeth's time. Her father also was pretty brutal in various campaigns, not in Ireland, but other places. The Pilgrimage of Grace comes to mind, but anyway, that's a different story. So Humphrey Gilbert he had seen brutal service in Ireland. He had brutalized the Irish. He was fond of having his captives come towards his tent, and on both sides of the road or the path to the tent, there will be spikes with the heads of their fellow soldiers or whatever, right? That sort of thing. He was a brutal man. Brutal. And he eventually called the Native Americans, the Indians, the same as the savage Irish. That sort of thing. So he saw the voyage to North America and hopefully colonizing North America as a continuation of what he was doing in Ireland. So in 1583, he won the charter. He won the license. And he took 5 ships, 260 men, and he had musicians and dancers to entertain the Indians and the local and the English as well. So he went with 5 ships. Eventually, 4 of those ships reached Newfoundland, which tells you that 1 ship was lost in the Atlantic. Okay? 4 ships reached Newfoundland. In 1583, Humphrey Gilbert lands in Newfoundland, and there is a symbolic ceremony that is held in which he is presented with a twig, which is a a twig of a plant and some of the turf or some of the soil of the land. It is given to Humphrey Gilbert to signify the possession of this land, of Newfoundland. 1583. But his job was to go and find good land near Florida, north of Florida. Newfoundland is too far north. So then he takes the remaining 4 ships and goes south. Okay. On the way, one of his ships is stranded and it is wrecked. So it hits shoals, which is like pieces of land and coral, which are slightly below the surface of the ocean, but it's pretty high. So in the night, if you're sailing, you may not be able to see this, and you will run aground. You'll hit that, and because of that, one of his ships was wrecked and destroyed. And this was a ship that contained most of the provisions and supplies and a lot of men. So I don't know how many men survived in that, but all their supplies and food stuff and all was lost, most of it, because of the loss of that one ship on the way down south. So he loses, it drowned 80 men. 80 men. He had 260, 80 are gone. And one ship was already lost in the Atlantic. So I'm not sure how many were left. So he loses the ski ship, which kills 80 men, and it takes down most of the fleet's provisions. And he is forced to send another ship back home with a cargo of sick men, because people get sick. So he's left with 2 ships. Okay? So he's left with just 2 ships, not enough supplies, not enough men to establish a new colony. So Sir Humphrey Gilbert has to reluctantly turn back towards England. He realizes it's not practical to found a colony now after everything that just happened. So he has to go back with just 2 ships. The ship that he's on is called the Squirrel. It is overloaded with men. And there's another ship which obviously could also be overloaded. And then they go eastwards, and somewhere near the Azores Islands, they run into what they call outrageous weather. And Gilbert's vessel goes down. Okay, and he was last seen reading a book in the captain's cabin by his sister ship. So he is lost at sea. And this voyage ends in failure, which is the 1583 Gilbert expedition to the lands that may lie north of Florida. He does claim Newfoundland for England, but then everything else is a disaster. Next year, Gilbert's charter is inherited by his half-brother, his younger brother, whose name is Walter Raleigh. Okay, he had a half-brother, younger brother, called Walter Raleigh. And Walter Raleigh inherited Gilbert's charter to explore and take possession of new lands in the Americas. Now, Walter Raleigh is an interesting character. He was one of Elizabeth's closest minions. Okay, if you watch the movie Elizabeth, in which is directed by Shekhar Kapoor, you will see this incident that Elizabeth is walking somewhere and there's a puddle in front of her. And her closest minion, Walter Raleigh, takes off his new, extremely expensive fur jacket, and lays it on the puddle. And then Elizabeth walks over the jacket. His coat, his extremely expensive fur coat. So that's Walter Raleigh. So he would go all out in his, in charming his queen, and she liked him very much, and she gave him all kinds of, favors. Material favors and positions and so on and so forth. So he became very powerful and he became very wealthy. Walter Raleigh. So he inherited his elder half-brother Gilbert's charter to colonize the Americas. So he then decided that the next year after his brother died, 1584 is the year, he would send a reconnaissance voyage to scout the southeastern coast of North America. He was not hasty like his brother. He did not jump on a ship and go ahead. He sent a reconnaissance expedition. He planned thoroughly. He planned things properly. And he sent 2 ships to send on this reconnaissance voyage. One of the captains was a guy called Arthur Barlow. And Arthur Barlow, he reaches the coast of North America, Atlantic coast, and he praises the beauty of the region, and he praises the hospitality of the natives. And they had a very pleasant stay of several weeks where they landed. And they write that one of the islands where they landed is called by the natives as Roanoke, Roanoak, Roanoke Island. And there was another island nearby which was called Croatoan Island, Croatoan, Croatoan Island. So the natives were very hospitable, very pleasant, and the English had a great stay of a few weeks. And then they sailed back home because it was not a mission to plant a colony, it was a reconnaissance mission. So they scouted the land, they found these islands, Roanoke and Croatoan. They found the natives are very pleasant, very hospitable, very friendly. And eventually, after a few weeks, this expedition sailed back across the Atlantic back to England, and they carried with them fur samples, they carried plant samples, and they also brought back 2 natives. Now, we don't know if the natives were taken willingly or unwillingly, we don't know. The 2 natives, one of them was called Manteo, he was from Croatoan Island, and the other was called Wanchesi. I don't know what the exact pronunciation is. If somebody among our viewers speaks Algonquian, then I apologize because I must have butchered the names, but it's Manteo and Wanchesi. Manteo was from Croatoan Island and Wanchesi was from Roanoke Island. So they bring back these 2 natives, and Sir Walter Raleigh takes the 2 natives, the Indians, into his home. He dresses them like Englishmen, very nice clothing and all. And he asks a scholar named Thomas Harriot to take charge of the education of Manteo and Wanchesi. So the objective is twofold. First of all, to teach them English. And secondly, to learn the local language, Algonquian, so that you can communicate with the natives. So a young scholar named Thomas Harriot is put in charge of these 2 natives and their education. So he starts compiling a dictionary of the Algonquian language, and he starts teaching them English. Okay, so now Raleigh says, okay, we have had a good experience. This was a successful reconnaissance mission. So he decides to name this region that his ships encountered. He decides to name it Virginia, after the Virgin Queen Elizabeth. Okay. And by the terms of the charter that he had inherited from his brother, he was allowed to claim a territory 600 miles from the site of his planned colony. Okay, but not lands possessed by Spain. So you plant a colony somewhere where you can claim lands 600 miles around that place. That was the deal. That was the terms of the charter. So now he names this territory Virginia, and this is a territory that stretches from the Carolinas. So in the southern United States, you have Florida, which is near Cuba. Okay, north of Florida, you have Georgia, then you have South Carolina, North Carolina, then you have Virginia, and then you have the northern states. So Virginia, which was an imaginary territory on a map at the time, it was a territory that stretched from the south, from the Carolinas, south and north, all the way to the state of Maine, which is northern New York area, etc. Big territory. Sir Walter Raleigh was then knighted by the Queen. She made him a knight. So Walter Raleigh became Sir Walter Raleigh. And then he proclaimed himself the Lord and Governor of Virginia, which was a realm that existed only on paper, and it was a territory that he would never visit in his life. But he became the Lord and Governor of Virginia. Then Raleigh did an interesting thing. He enlisted the services of a chronicler, historian, writer, whose name was Richard Hakluyt. He was a chronicler of European voyages of discovery. And he commissioned this guy to write a position paper advocating the colonization of America. Okay? And Richard Hakluyt did that. And he put forth 23 arguments for colonizing America and doing the Western planting, the planting of the Western culture and people in the Americas. Now, look at what he advocated. He gave 23 arguments. I'll list some of them. One was about economic self-sufficiency. So he said that America had access to a tremendous amount of raw materials. Not access, but America was home to a lot of raw materials. Timber, minerals, and other natural resources. And if you gained access to that, it would free England from having to rely on European suppliers. So if you can grab a territory in the Americas, you will have access to all of this. And you won't have to rely on any of your neighbors or allies or competitors. So this was about access to raw materials and economic self-sufficiency. Secondly, and also, if England succeeded in planting a significant colony or a significant population in America, in Virginia, then these colonists would become a new market for English goods. Okay? Like woolen cloth, for example, which you don't find in the Americas. Sheep are not native to the Americas. So they will need woolen cloth and all that. So England can sell them that. So once again, you can gain value and riches from the Americas. Okay? Very different approach to the Spanish. Now more. Hakluyt said that this would be a solution to overpopulation. So at that time, there was a large population in England of what were called vagabonds. Okay? Because of increasing prosperity, etc. in England, there was a bigger population, about 3 million at the time. And many of them were vagabonds, many of them were unemployed, many of them had to turn to criminality, etc. And at the time, you had very harsh death penalties. Even children would be hanged on the gallows. So the Americas would be an outlet for the surplus poor of England. Instead of becoming food for the gallows, send them to the Americas and they will colonize and populate the land. Okay? And obviously, this will also prevent unrest in England. If you have a lot of unemployed people who are poor, then there will be criminality, there will be unrest, there will be riots, send them all across the Atlantic. It will solve multiple problems with one stone. Then, strategic and military advantages. And a colony in the Americas, or multiple colonies, multiple outposts in the Americas, would be a strong counterbalance to Spain. Okay, Spain was a big enemy. So this would challenge Catholic Spain's power and territorial claims. You can't allow them to take the whole of the Americas. You got to do something about this. And if you establish settlements there, you can establish naval bases, military bases in North America. And these would serve as bases from which you can harass Spanish shipping, you can protect English merchant vessels, and you can further England's naval interests. So that's another reason why England should colonize North America. Then they said that we need to prioritize commerce over conversion. Okay? Unlike Spain's emphasis on religious conversion, we discussed the requerimiento, right? Where they had to read out a certain religious text and then before attacking the Indians. That's what Coronado and other people did during their expeditions. So the English said that we need to focus firmly on trade. We need to focus on wealth creation and on expanding England's global commerce. Forget about conversion. We don't care. We want to focus on commerce, expanding our footprint. And Hakluyt said that securing control over trade routes and goods would grant England broader geopolitical power. And Raleigh said that he who commands trade commands the riches of the world and therefore commands the whole world. It's an incredibly hard-headed approach. Very different from the Spanish approach.
Right.
The Spanish were all brutality. These guys, the English, they said we don't care about conversion. We just want to expand our trade footprint over the world because if we command trade, if we control trade, we'll control the whole world. We'll own the riches of the whole world. Incredibly different position from the Spanish. And then there was talk about enhancing England's status and prestige among the European nations and laying the foundations for the future growth of England and eventually, hopefully, having a global influence over the whole of the world. You can see the roots and beginnings of America in this. Right?
Right.
So this was a position paper. I'm sure I've left out some of the points. There were 23 points. But these points put out by Richard Hakluyt and Walter Raleigh, they capture the approach of the English, the pragmatic approach, the economic and strategic thrust of what they were trying to do. And this is the approach that helped shape England's approach to colonization, which was completely different from that of Spain or other countries. Even the French were like amateurs in what they were doing. They did not want to convert anyone, but you see, England's approach was completely different. And they put out a proper position paper on what needs to happen and why these things need to happen. So it gave them incredible clarity and focus on what they needed to focus on, essentially. So this was a position paper put out by Richard Hakluyt at the behest of Walter Raleigh. So now, Walter Raleigh had sent a scouting expedition, reconnaissance mission, which was very successful. They discovered this region, the Roanoke Island and Croatoan Island, and they found the natives are very peaceful and very friendly. So then he now sends out a fleet. Raleigh now sends out a fleet whose purpose is no longer reconnaissance. It's now to establish a colony. He sends out this fleet in 1585. Okay?
Next year.
Yes. And the fleet is commanded by a gentleman called Sir Richard Grenville. Richard Grenville. Richard Grenville was another brutal person. But he was knighted by the English queen, or king, I don't know who it was, but yeah, he was knighted. So that's why he's called
Must be
Sir,
queen, right?
I'm not sure, whatever. So he was called Sir Richard Grenville. So Sir Richard Grenville goes across the Atlantic and he deposits 108 men on Roanoke Island.
Okay.
And among these men are Thomas Harriot, the scholar who was teaching Vanchese and Manteo, the English language.
Yeah.
There's another guy called Ralph Lane. Okay, who is the commander. And there's an artist whose name is John White. So it's 108 men in total. No women, no children. Okay? So it's a military outpost, essentially, which they establish over here under the command of Ralph Lane. And Manteo and Vanchese, the two natives who were taken to England, they return on this expedition. They return back to their homeland. So Manteo was from Croatoan Island, not from Roanoke. And Vanchese was from Roanoke Island, where they established the settlement. Croatoan was nearby, not very far away. So they establish a fort, a military outpost, which is manned by 108 men on Roanoke Island. Now, once again, they clearly did not think things through. There were limited supplies, and there was nobody who had any understanding of agriculture or farming. They had no crops to sow. So eventually, after some time, you're going to run out of food. Right? So that eventually happened. So they had to rely on the natives. And the natives were generous people. They tried their best to keep the English supplied. But eventually, they can't keep them supplied indefinitely because they also have limited supplies, the natives, the Indians. And then the English will resort to stealing Indian supplies.
Like French people.
Exactly the same thing. So once again, conflict arises between the colonialists, the colonizers, and the natives. And whatever goodwill they had was quickly evaporated. Now, this guy Thomas Harriot, the scientist, his job was to take notes of the local plants and animals and roots and berries and everything, because that would be useful on future subsequent voyages. So he made detailed observations, he made drawings, and he was very happy over there because there was so much new vegetation and flora and fauna to study over there. And so he made lots of wonderful observations and drawings of all of this. And Harriet discovered a local plant which he loved more than every other plant.
What was that?
Tobacco.
Oh.
Okay, it was tobacco. So he discovered tobacco. And at some point in time, tobacco had already reached Spain. I think it was the French ambassador to Spain or Portugal. His name was Jean Nicot, Nicot, who introduced tobacco to the Spanish. And Jean Nicot's surname, Nicot, Nicot is the root word for nicotine.
Oh.
Okay?
Wow.
Yeah, anyway. So this guy, Thomas Harriot, he discovers tobacco. He becomes a user. And he wrote long treatises about the wonderful medicinal properties of tobacco. It opens up all the pores in your body and it expels all the bad things out of your body, etc. Today, if people, when we have cigarettes, right? People smoke cigarettes. Cigarettes contain all kinds of unnatural chemicals besides on top of tobacco to make them as addictive as possible. But I believe the original tobacco was not supposed to be inhaled. It was supposed to be smoked the way people smoke cigars. And maybe it was not as harmful as cigarettes are. So anyway, John Harriot was a huge fan of tobacco. He wrote a lot about tobacco. And it was as a consequence of this expedition that tobacco was introduced into England. Okay, but yeah, right now there's trouble. There's starvation. They're raiding the supplies of the natives. That's what the English are doing, and they've lost goodwill. The natives are fighting back. They have bows and arrows and stuff, so not nice. And wherever these colonists travel, whichever village they go to, they discovered that when they left the village, in a very short time, the natives started dying. The natives started dying in large numbers. Okay?
Why so?
Because of epidemic diseases brought from England, brought from Europe. And the natives did not have immunity towards these diseases. So the natives started regarding the English with a tremendous amount of suspicion, superstition, and fear. They thought that the English had invisible magic bullets they were firing from far away. And so hostilities increased between the English and the natives because of all these reasons, because of the raiding of supplies, because of the epidemics that were starting to rage, which the natives blamed on the English. And eventually Ralph Lane, he kidnapped and beheaded an Indian chief to force the natives to give more supplies. So once again, relations essentially went downhill and they went rock bottom between the foreigners and the natives. So we are talking about 1586. So later that year, a privateer called Sir Francis Drake, pirate, arrived with privateering ships, which means pirate ships. And he discovers his fellow countrymen over here in a terrible position. They are starving, they are short on supplies, they are in conflict with the natives, and they are anticipating a big retaliation from the natives. So Sir Francis Drake arrives with a cargo of slaves, etc. So he discovers the situation and he takes all the colonists on his ships and they sail back home to England. Okay? This is late 1586. So all the colonists, they are able to escape on board Sir Francis Drake's ships and they go back to England. And just a few days after this happens, Sir Richard Grenville arrives with his reinforcements. So he's the guy who was the original commander of the expedition. He's the guy who deposited 108 men on Roanoke Island.
Yeah.
And he quickly left because he was a privateer himself and he had privateering business to do. So that's why he quickly left. And he had told them that I'll come back as soon as possible with supplies. So he comes just a few days after the colonists have escaped with Sir Francis Drake. And he looks around, where are my people? Where are my people? And he finds nobody. So what he does is that he leaves behind 18 men, okay, on Roanoke Island to hold the fort. And then he says that I'll 18. And he goes back and he says that I'll come back with more people and supplies and all that. So that's 1586. 18 men are left behind by Sir Richard Grenville. And he goes back to get more people and supplies. So he goes back to England and the financier of the expedition, Sir Walter Raleigh, comes to know about what's happened, the situation. So he says that we should now adopt a new approach. We tried a military outpost, a military colony. Let's now actually have a proper settlement. Now, no settlement is proper without women and children, right? It needs to be a proper family kind of environment, not just men, soldiers. So Walter Raleigh decides to send families and craftsmen and even some farmers on this new expedition, which happens in 1587. And the objective is to form a proper self-sustaining colony. okay, which is not reliant on outside intervention for resupplies. So it's going to be a self-sustaining civilian colony mainly, rather than a military fort or garrison. So John White, the artist of the second expedition, or the first military outpost, he was the artist. He is now named as the governor of this colony. And 117 settlers, including women and children, now sail for America. This is 1587. Okay? And their intention is not to settle at Roanoke Island. It is to settle a few miles north in the Bay of the Chesapeakeans. The Chesapeakeans were a local tribe there. It's now called Chesapeake Bay.
Okay.
Okay? So the intention was to settle in the Chesapeake Bay area, not in Roanoke Island. So they go cross the Atlantic and they reach Roanoke Island first. The intention was to settle Chesapeake Bay, but the pilot or the captain of this ship, he refused to sail further to Chesapeake Bay. He said that it's too late in the year and I have to go back for resupplies and the weather is bad, blah, 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 blah. Excuses. He was a privateer. He had other business to attend to. Piracy. It's more lucrative. So he deposits these people on Roanoke Island and sails off. And they cannot reach Chesapeake Island. So they're all left on Roanoke Island. Their leader is John White. Now, they are aware that 18 men were holding the fort. So they go to the fort. There's no 18 men there.
Oh, where did they go?
There is no 18 men there. The men are missing. The place is overgrown with melons. Wild deer are eating the melons. So clearly somebody had planted melons. And now the melons are grown everywhere. And they find the bones of one man.
Oh.
So what they found so they eventually contacted the natives of Croatoan Island. Okay? Manteo was from Croatoan Island. So they contacted the natives of Croatoan Island and they discovered that Grenville's 18 men were killed by hostile natives from the mainland. See, Roanoke Island is not far from the mainland. It's just a few kilometers from the mainland. You can actually cross it at low tide by wading in water, possibly, maybe at that time. So so those 18 men were killed by the natives, who were led by Wanchese. Remember Manteo and Wanchese, who went to England and who learned English and taught the scholar Harriet their local language, Algonquin. So Wanchese was from Roanoke Island, that tribe, and Manteo was from Croatoan Island. So Manteo liked the English. Wanchese hated the English.
Oh, okay.
So when he got the opportunity that only 18 men are left, he had them raided and killed. That's what John White and his colonists learned from the Croatoan Indians. Okay? So yeah, it's a bad situation. They understand that these natives, apart from the Croatoan natives, are all hostile to us. Okay? And then John White had a daughter. Her name was what was her name? I don't remember her name. But she was married to a guy called Dare, D-A-R-E. So she gave birth on Roanoke Island to the first child ever of English origin ever to be born in the Americas. And this was a girl whose name was Virginia Dare. Okay? The first white person or European origin person to be born in the Americas was Snorri. What's his name? What was that Vinland saga? Who's the hero? Thorfinn. Snorri Thorfinnsson. So the first European child to be born in the Americas was born around 1000 AD. Snorri Thorfinnsson. But the first English child to be born in the Americas was Virginia Dare.
Okay.
So she was born on Roanoke Island. And so she's the first English child to be born in the New World, essentially. And so the settlers, led by John White, they realize they need allies. So they know that the tribes people of Croatoan Island nearby are friendly with us. So what they do is that they baptize Manteo, make him Christian, and they give him the title of the Lord of Roanoke. So they gave him Roanoke Island as well. Okay, so this kind of creates an English-Indian alliance. Okay, now we're talking about 1587. That's when that's when John White and his people, they arrive here, and they realize the situation is bad. So the settlers, and then there are ambushes by the hostile natives. Some people are killed. So eventually the colonists, they tell their leader, John White, that he needs to go back to England and come back with reinforcements and supplies. Because the supplies that we have aren't enough, and we don't have enough settlers here to be able to withstand an assault if the natives decide to exterminate us. So they plead to John White that he needs to go, and eventually, reluctantly, he goes. He goes back to England. He leaves behind his daughter, his son-in-law, and his granddaughter Virginia Dare. A total of 113 people are left when John White goes back to England. It's the last time John White or any English people see these 113 people.
Okay.
Okay, so what happens? So 1587, John White goes back to England. 1588. So first of all, while John White is going back to England, he goes back on a privateering ship, which doesn't go back straight to England. It has business to attend to. It has piracy to do. So it does all the piracy it can and then eventually reaches England. Now, 1588, England is under crisis. Geopolitical crisis.
Yes.
The Spanish send the Spanish Armada to invade and conquer England. Hundreds of Spanish warships. The biggest invasion fleet you can imagine. And they were so confident. Philip II was so confident that his Armada would conquer England. He sent orange trees in some of the ships.
Why?
Because he wanted, oranges grew in Spain but not in England. So he wanted England to be more Spanish once it was conquered.
Okay.
So we'll plant orange trees and make it more Spain-like. He was so confident. So Elizabeth is under crisis. England is under crisis. And so this is a crisis, the Spanish Armada crisis, 1588. And eventually the Spanish Armada attacks England. And the English Navy fights back. And two of the commanders of the English Navy are John Hawkins and Sir Francis Drake.
Oh, okay.
And they defeat the Spanish Armada. Despite being outnumbered and having smaller ship. They have more agile ships, and their tactics and strategies allow them to defeat the Spanish Armada. It's a disaster for Spain, and English confidence suddenly grows sky high. And we can defeat Spain, we can take on the whole world.
Correct, yeah.
Okay? But in the meanwhile, John White is not able to go back to America because this is because all English ships are right now being pressed into service to look out for the Spanish and fight the Spanish. And even after the Armada is defeated, there's a period during which the English are still on high alert. So John White, what he does is that he tries to send two ships to America to rescue his people. But those two ships, their captains are also privateers. So they say, okay, we'll go there, wait for a while. We have some business to attend to. So they do piracy and stuff. And then there are storms, which blow them back to England. Doesn't work. So eventually John White he manages to return to Roanoke Island in 1590. He left in 1587.
Yeah, 3
He
years
reaches
later.
there, in 1590. He finds the fort is still standing, but all the other houses and whatever was built, it's all dismantled. And the chests in which all the goods are kept, they're all buried, but they've been ransacked. And everything is lying about. Artillery pieces and guns are lying in the sand. And there's no person there. Okay? And he looks around, he does some reconnaissance and all that, and he discovers a tree on which 3 letters are carved. CRO.
What does that mean?
CRO is carved on a tree.
Okay.
People are still wondering what it means.
Okay.
And then on one of the logs of one of the posts of the fort, a word is carved. So on the tree it was CRO. On this post it is CROATOAN. Croatoan. The name of that island.
Okay.
Okay?
Yes.
So this indicates so before he left, he had an agreement with the settlers that he left behind. If there is any crisis, if there's any problem, you have to leave the place. You need to carve the name of the place where you're going
Okay.
somewhere so that I can find it. And if you are leaving because of some great danger, you have to carve a cross.
Okay.
So we know that there was a tremendous danger. But they did not find any crosses. So it looked like, so no distress symbol was found, no carved cross anywhere, which suggests that the colonists left peacefully
Okay.
from Roanoke Island. So because it says Croatoan, it meant that the colonists would have gone to Croatoan Island from Roanoke Island. So then White said that we should sail to Croatoan Island, which should take a few hours. And they tried to do that. The captain of the ship agreed to do that, but then there was bad weather. And the ship was blown off towards the West Indies. And then they said that, okay, let's wait in the West Indies until the winter is over because it's bad season, hurricane season, and we'll return to Croatoan Island in spring. And they tried returning in spring, but there was another storm which blew them back all the way into the Atlantic on the way to England. So they go back to England. And John White never returns to the Americas. He's never able to return again. Okay? So he wrote. He was a writer in between 1590 and 1593. He wrote about the lost colonists and he expressed despair and he said that I pray to God that somebody will rescue them and so on. But they were lost and they are still lost. Okay, so that's 1590 that he has to go back to England. 1591, early 1591, that he goes back to England without discovering what happened to his people. Now, in the early 1600s, there was a settlement called Jamestown for the north. English settlement called Jamestown for the north. And the settlers of Jamestown, they heard rumors from the natives that some English people survive in the interiors of Americas. But there was no definitive proof of anything. They heard tales, they heard stories, but they never met the people.
Early 17th century or 16th?
Early 17th century, early 1600s, which is early 17th century.
Right.
Okay? Jamestown settlers, they heard about it. We'll discuss Jamestown afterwards in the next episode. So they heard stories of survivors and they had heard of Roanoke, so they would have put two and two together possibly. But they never actually found any definitive hard evidence or proof, or they never met anybody. But they heard the stories. Now, what happened to Walter Raleigh? Walter Raleigh was one of the closest minions that Queen Elizabeth had. But then he secretly married one of her ladies and got her pregnant. And that angered Elizabeth because he did not take her permission.
Okay.
So that strained relations between Elizabeth and Sir Walter Raleigh. Elizabeth eventually dies in 1603 or something. Okay, and her successor as king is King James, who is her cousin, I think. And Elizabeth was very angry with Sir Walter Raleigh, but she did not take any harsh steps against him. She let him be. Now James comes to power. He becomes the king. He doesn't like Walter Raleigh.
Okay.
So he has him imprisoned in the Tower of London, and he trumps up some charges against him of treason or whatever, and he's condemned to death by hanging, drawing, and quartering. William Wallace, he was hanged, drawn, and quartered. So it is a brutal death. I will not describe how it is done, but because we don't need to do that. But it's brutal. It's barbarous. It's horrible. It's torture. So he's condemned to death. But at the last moment, he wins a reprieve. So his death sentence is revoked, but he remains in the Tower of London. So, but many years later, in 1618, James I finds some other excuse to get rid of Walter Raleigh. So he condemns him to death, and Walter Raleigh is taken to the execution place, which is a block of wood with an axe to chop your head off. So before he goes there, he wears his finest clothes. He smokes one last pipe of tobacco because he loved tobacco. He had popularized tobacco across England. And then he climbs the execution thing, the scaffolding, and he puts his head on the block. And the executioner, for some reason, hesitates. So Sir Walter Raleigh's last words are, "Strike, man, strike." And he was executed. So that's the end of Sir Walter Raleigh. And his promotion of tobacco was a game changer which we will discuss later, was a game changer for the American colonies. Okay. So we go back to Roanoke. We're discussing Roanoke. This became a mystery, an enduring mystery. In 1701, an English naturalist, natural historian, scientist called John Lawson, he traveled to the site of Roanoke Island, and he encountered coastal Indians, natives, who had light skin and gray eyes, which is not found among the Indians. And this obviously gave birth to theories that there was intermarriage of the English with the natives over there. And people have tried to do archaeological digs at Roanoke and all that, but the problem is that we don't know where the fort was. And it's most likely that the place where the fort was is now underwater because of erosion and various natural processes.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, and they have also done archaeological digs at Croatoan Island, which is now called Hatteras Island, Cape Hatteras. Okay, and they found some pieces of evidence that show English presence there. There was an English presence over there, but even today, we don't quite know what happened to
those 113 people. Yeah.
To the 113 people who had left behind,
including that girl,
Virginia Dare, the first English child to be born in the New World. So archaeologists have been trying to find what happened. Genealogists, DNA researchers, everybody, historians are still engaged in the pursuit of what happened. So that's going on. Today, if you go to Roanoke Island, it still exists. It's connected to the mainland by bridges. Okay, and there are two towns or settlements on Roanoke Island. One is called Manteo, one is called Wanchese. And there are streets named after Sir Walter Raleigh and Queen Elizabeth.
Yes.
Okay. And there's a statue of Virginia Dare as a young woman. Okay. It's called the Dare Venus for some reason. Okay. And Virginia Dare has become a symbol of English expansion and racial purity and all that in for the Americans. Especially in the 19th century, it was that sort of thing. And it's also a broader symbol for American origin stories in the New World. Now, there are all kinds of theories for what happened to the Roanoke Island colonists, the 113 people. Some people say there was an alien abduction. Some people say they sailed off to Atlantis.
Okay.
And some people say that there were kidnappings or whatever. But most plausible stories fall into two categories. Either a massacre or intermarriage. So Roanoke Island there was a big empire in the region. And the emperor, so to say, of the natives was called Powhatan. His name was Powhatan. And there's a theory that these colonists eventually moved to Chesapeake Bay as they had originally intended to do.
Correct.
But the captain left them at Roanoke, right?
Right.
So eventually the story is that they may have moved to the Chesapeake Bay area. And apparently it's a possibility that the chief Powhatan may have slaughtered them. Okay, that's
one theory.
Yeah, so that's based on rumors that the Jamestown settlers had heard, that either the English settled there or they heard conflicting accounts. They were either massacred or they settled and intermingled or that sort of thing. So that's one theory, the Powhatan massacre theory. The second is a theory of assimilation. That maybe they first went to Croatoan Island and the Croatoan natives were friendly with them. So they had to settle down over there. And they left some people for some time at Croatoan Island. If you go there today, to Hatteras Island, as it's now called, you will see that you can see the Atlantic Ocean in three directions. It's a great place to keep watch over incoming ships. So maybe they kept some people over there at Croatoan Island to wait for John White to return.
Correct, yeah.
And eventually when this did not happen, they would have intermingled with the Croatoan people and maybe moved to the mainland or to the Chesapeake Bay region, or most likely the mainland. Okay, and they have found archaeological artifacts on this island, Croatoan Island, which includes weapons, fragments of weapons, rings that Europeans typically wear, and so on and so forth, which kind of suggests that the English lived there for some time. Yeah. And like I said, the grey-eyed natives were observed in later centuries in this region, which suggests that there was intermingling. And there are DNA projects underway right now. I'm not sure how successful they may or may not be. Hopefully, we'll find some kind of clues as to what happened. In 1885, the General Assembly, we're talking about 1885 now, okay, long time later, 19th century, late 19th century, the General Assembly of North Carolina, it passed a legislation designating the people of this region, the natives of this region, as Croatoan Indians, okay, descendants of the people of Monteo. And this legislation accorded these Croatoan Indians marginally greater rights than the rest of the non-white population, because maybe they had some white blood in them.
Okay.
Super racist, isn't it? But that's the way it was. That's America.
Yeah.
That's what it used to be. So the lost colony is still lost. And if you go to Roanoke Island, they don't like the archaeologists and researchers, because someday they might discover the truth, and then the mystery is gone, and people won't come there to
Right.
Because if there's a big mystery, people come there as tourists and all that. They want to stay there and all.
Yeah.
But if everything is black and white, then what's the big deal now? Yeah.
Right.
So Roanoke, which was an experiment from 1585 to 87, or maybe later also if they survived, this was England's first attempt to establish a permanent colony, permanent settlement in the New World, in North America. It predates Jamestown, it predates Plymouth. It was an experiment in 3 parts. First, a reconnaissance mission, then a military settlement, military fort, and then a civilian settlement. And it did not work. So lots of unanswered questions when it comes to Roanoke. Now let's discuss piracy for a while. We have alluded to a lot of piracy during this discussion. Let's discuss piracy. You will see that piracy had state support in England, support from the Crown of England. We discussed John Hawkins. He was a privateer. His principal activity was to seize slaves, steal slaves from Portuguese ships and Portuguese ports in Africa. So he would go there, he would overpower them, he would seize as many slaves as possible, load them as cargo in his ships, then sail across the Atlantic to the Spanish West Indies, steal from the Portuguese, sell to the Spanish, okay, and make as much money as possible along the way. And while traveling from Africa to the West Indies and from West Indies to England, that's a long journey. So engage in some other extracurricular activities, more piracy along the way. Raid Spanish ships, raid Portuguese ships, raid whoever you can. So that's the kind of activities that was his niche, John Hawkins. And he was eventually knighted, okay, by Queen Elizabeth. And she had given him a royal ship, the Jesus of Lubeck. So one of his pirate ships was a ship given to him by the Queen of England. And eventually, for all these activities, she knighted him. So this essentially legitimizes piracy, doesn't it? This sort of gesture of knighting a pirate. So piracy was a state policy of England. Okay, then, and we know that how he eventually lost a naval battle to the Spanish, and he had to leave 100 men behind along the Gulf of Mexico. And eventually, this gave rise to all those tall tales of gold and fire dragons and red sheep and all that, which was the catalyst for England's efforts to colonize North America. So that's John Hawkins. Now we have Sir Richard Grenville as well, the guy who dropped 108 people on Roanoke Island. So when he was going towards Roanoke from England, so this guy was a brute. He's an absolute brute. Okay, he brutalized the Irish. He was known to kill people in street brawls, and he used to chew glass as a parlor trick.
Oh my God!
Chew glass. He was an absolute brutal guy. Okay, so privateering was part of what he did, and he was commissioned to do privateering. And when he went on his voyage to Virginia, okay, so the intention was to plant the first English colony at Roanoke Island. But on the journey across the Atlantic, he was raiding Spanish ships and all that, which whenever the opportunity arose.
Right.
So that's he was doing that. So it was kind of an extracurricular activity
Yeah.
for him. So he deposits 108 people at Roanoke. Then he returns to England, but he hurried off from Roanoke as soon as possible because he had more piracy to do. It was very lucrative. You got lots of valuables from the activity of piracy, gold and whatnot. So his swift exit stranded the people there. He could perhaps have given them more supplies or something. So that is Richard Grenville. Then you have Sir Francis Drake, one of the great heroes of the English victory over the Spanish Armada. He was a privateer. He used to plunder Spanish possessions in the Caribbean, in Florida. In 1586, he plundered Saint Augustine.
Oh.
Okay, that settlement, and he would generally transport hundreds of Africans from Africa to the New World, and then he would also transport hundreds of Indians to different parts of wherever he went. So he was dealing in slaves, Africans as well as Native Americans or Indians. So Francis Drake is the guy who arrived at Roanoke Island during the first trip there, right? During the first occupation of the island. And he was able to take the stranded Englishmen back to England, right? So when he came there, he had a ship full of stolen goods, which is slaves.
Okay.
So another pirate. The second Roanoke expedition, or the third one rather, after the reconnaissance mission of Walter Raleigh, John White was the leader, right? And they sailed in 1587, and there was a delay in the West Indies because the ship's captain, he said that I have to spend several weeks in the Caribbean to gather provisions, but he was actually doing piracy in the Caribbean region, and then he reaches Roanoke Island. They were supposed to go to Chesapeake Bay.
Yes.
But he dropped them off to Roanoke Island. He said that various excuses.
Yeah.
He was impatient to return to piracy. That's why he dropped them off at Roanoke Island, not Chesapeake. And that's how the whole mystery begins. So that's another pirate. And then in 1590, John White was finally able to return on a return voyage to Roanoke to try and rescue his people. So he had to go aboard a privateering expedition, a piracy expedition. And these were not rescue ships, these were pirate ships. So they, on the way to Roanoke, they did lots of raiding of various ships and all that. Lots of time was wasted in that, raiding, looting, piracy. And eventually, so they went on a long winding route to Roanoke. And they eventually reached the region, but because of severe weather and all that, they had to eventually leave. So these people all prioritized piracy and profit over what the original mission was. And that's why many of these missions did not succeed because of these delays and these other priorities that the captains had. So early English colonization was financed at least partially by piracy. Many of these pirates were entrepreneurs. See, when it comes to the Spanish, we know that the Spanish crown would give these expeditions the permission or the license to go and discover lands in the Americas. And the Spanish crown did not finance these expeditions. They were all self-financed. Hernando de Soto had to go into debt to finance his expedition. The Coronado expedition was financed by the governor of Mexico, who had to go into debt to finance it.
Right.
So this was the Spanish model. Individuals would go into debt, take money and finance their expeditions and hope that it will pay off. There'll be a jackpot. In England, there was a different model by the 1600s. Joint stock companies. So multiple business people would come together, form a joint stock company, and they would all put a certain amount of money, which will determine how much stock they have, and they would jointly finance these expeditions. And many of these were piracy expeditions. Okay? So, yeah, that's the kind of thing that you had. Joint stock companies. Elizabeth dies 1603. When was the East India Company founded? Somewhere around this time.
Yeah, I think when they came to India was 1607 in the, I'm talking about
Surat.
Gujarat, in Surat.
Yeah. So the East India Company would have been founded some years before.
Somewhere that time, I don't recollect.
So
exactly.
they founded joint stock companies to finance expeditions east as well as west. So that's what you had. So English colonization was financed at least partially by piracy, and there was a dual focus on establishing colonies, but also looting Spanish fleets along the way. And this often derailed expeditions and led to the demise and failure of these expeditions. So there were detours, and that's why many of the expeditions failed. So we have pirates like like Hawkins, like Grenville, like Drake. And for these people, the pursuit of quick money, Spanish gold, overshadowed the long-term objectives very often. Okay, the Spanish they were all short-termists. They were not there to have a long-term presence or something. They just wanted gold. The only objective was gold. The moment the Spanish heard gold, they would go crazy and they would do all kinds of stupid things. So the English had a dual approach. They had a long-term objective, but they also had this short-termism that let's loot as much Spanish gold as possible along the way. So this obviously contributed to the failure of the Roanoke colony and the disappearance of the natives. It's possible their descendants still live, but that's yet to be confirmed. So piracy was interwoven in every English adventure or venture of colonization, and it contributed to the failure of the Roanoke colony. So England essentially at that time was a nation of pirates. That was their approach. But they had a very hard-headed approach towards colonization. It was not about conversions. It was all about securing trade routes, creating colonies and outposts, military outposts, naval outposts. And it was about eventually controlling the world. That's what Francis Drake and Richard Hakluyt wrote about in their position paper with 23 points. And in that position paper, more than anything else, you see the beginnings of the superpower called the United States. England first became the superpower. The sun never set on the British Empire, but the eventual successor of superpower status was Washington, was the United States, after power was transferred from London to Washington, D.C. At the end of the Second World War. So you can see the origins of the superpower, United States, in that position paper of Richard Grenville not Richard Grenville.
I forget the name.
Of Raleigh, Walter Raleigh. Walter Raleigh and Richard Hakluyt.
But he never came back, right?
Who never came back?
Meaning, though the name was given some...
Virginia. He named it Virginia. But he never ever visited North America.
So it was...
He was himself a soldier and so on, but he preferred to operate out of palaces and things like that.
Yeah, not physically, just technically.
No, he was a soldier, but he was prone to seasickness. Okay, Walter Raleigh was a soldier. He fought. He was not some dandy who lived who preferred to hide behind curtains. He was a soldier, a warrior.
Yeah. So in this,
but he was prone to seasickness. So he decided to finance everything remotely and have people carry out the expeditions on his behalf.
Right.
He did not go there himself. And eventually he met his demise on the scaffolding in the Tower of London, in London. And I've actually visited the place where his head was chopped off. Well, that's the story of these two expeditions. The first one is obviously in Florida, the French expedition, René de Laudonnière and those people. The French tried. And they tried to have a different approach from the Spaniards. They tried a different approach. But eventually, because of various reasons, the same old reasons, they could not live off the land. That's why they had to start raiding Indian villages for supplies, and that's how things went south.
I think I would say that, it was because the king and the queen also, they wanted to, the Protestant to be away from that was one thing. If they had a support from the king and queen, 100%.
They had support.
In the sense how they were trying to do initially.
They had the support of the king and of the French crown because they wanted the Protestants gone. So how do you ensure they're gone? By taking care of them and making sure that they succeed over there.
Right. But what I'm saying is that not to expand the thing, how in the other, how Spanish or British, how they try to colonize a thing, not that kind of approach. What I'm trying to say is that here, the king and the queen.
That's an interesting point.
Am I correct? Yeah.
It's
so that is something that,
So the Spanish were after gold. No question about it. They wanted gold, and to gain the gold, you had to hold on to large territories. That was the Spanish approach.
Right.
The English approach was based on the position paper, which is a very hard-headed approach, very practical, pragmatic approach, long-term approach.
Right.
And they also had short-termists, all the privateers.
Extra money.
What were the French after?
Yeah.
They didn't mind the gold, but they actually wanted to be rid of the Huguenots, the French crown.
Right.
The Huguenots did not mind looking for gold. They tried, but they did not find any. I think they found the natives in possession of some small amounts of gold,
Right.
gold plates and all that. And the natives told the Huguenots that there's more gold inland. The truth is that those gold plates and whatever the natives had, that the Huguenots saw, that gold came from shipwrecked Spanish ships who were transporting the gold from South
outside.
America.
Okay.
So it's not like the natives in Florida had found gold reserves,
Right.
or gold mines. They just salvaged whatever they could from Spanish shipwrecks, which includes some gold.
Yeah.
So the Huguenots did not mine gold. They tried to look for gold. They did not find any. But the French crown, which is the driving force, which obviously should be the driving force, it actually wanted to get rid of the Huguenots, and they did not really care about gold. And they wanted to kind of counterbalance the Spanish. The Spanish have this territory. We should also have some
Right.
territory. But they had no long-term
Plans.
reason why are we doing this, a real why that drives everything else. So the English were very clear about that. It's not just about territory, it's about securing trade routes, it's about securing trading routes and creating trading outposts and out-trading everybody else. And by securing the trade of the world, you control the wealth of the world and eventually the world itself.
Right.
That was the approach of the English. Very clear. And you have to give credit to Sir Walter Raleigh for commissioning this position paper and then giving it to Queen Elizabeth.
Yeah.
So that laid out the approach.
Right.
And that's an approach that still kind of continues when it comes to the superpower, the United States that we're discussing. So yeah, that's about where we end today's episode. We have gone forward in the journey. This one book has given rise to 3 episodes, and we're going to have to do one more episode to conclude the contents of this book. So Tony Horvitz has outlined multiple expeditions. And there's 2 more expeditions that we're going to discuss. One is Jamestown, and the second, briefly, we will cover Plymouth, which is the Pilgrims, which is what the Americans regard as the true birth of their nation. But we will not do it in this episode, otherwise it will go on forever. We'll stop here and we'll discuss those 2 things in the next episode. All right.